Ja, hallo und willkommen zu einer weiteren Veranstaltung der Reihe Einwände. Hi, JJ Bowler, can you hear us?
Hey, hi.
Yeah, welcome. We're really happy and glad you could make it, and we can receive you in Munich virtually at least. It was
Thank
planned
you.
to have you here in real life, but maybe we'll do that another time,
Hopefully. Thank you for
hopefully.
having me, though. Thank you for having me. Very excited.
I'll just really quickly introduce the event in German and then I'll switch back to English again. Or how good is your German? I don't know. Maybe you can follow me.
It's getting better, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah. Ja, no worries. Okay, so ja, ganz kurz nochmal auf Deutsch. Der Rest der Veranstaltung wird dann auf Englisch ablaufen. Die Lesung heute ist Teil der Reihe Einwände, kuratiert vom Bellevue de Monaco und vom Münchner Stadtmuseum. Und dabei geht es darum, dass AutorInnen eingeladen werden, die sich mit den Themen Diversität, Migration, Gleichberechtigung befassen. Und es gab davor schon 2 Lesungen mit Hasnain Kasim und mit Max Czolek. Heute mit JJ Bowler und das nächste Mal wird dann hoffentlich Emilia Roark kommen. Zu der Veranstaltungsreihe gehört auch noch eine Ausstellung, die bis jetzt noch nicht eröffnet ist, aber im Frühling bald zu sehen wird, nämlich am Sebastiansplatz wird die zugänglich sein und das wird passend zur Veranstaltung Einwände, eine Wand sein, auf der dann ein Wandbild drauf ist. Und hoffentlich, sobald es wieder möglich ist, im Frühling wird es dort dann auch Lesungen, Theatervorstellungen, Diskussionen, unterschiedliche Veranstaltungen geben. Also wir hoffen, dass es bald möglich sein wird. Genau, und zum heutigen Ablauf, also wie ich gerade schon gesagt hatte, eigentlich hatten wir geplant, eine Präsenzveranstaltung zu machen, JJ Bowler hier zu haben, mit Publikum am besten. Das geht leider nicht, aber deswegen haben wir heute einen kostenlosen Livestream. Es gibt aber die Möglichkeit zu spenden an das Bellevue und die Infos dazu werden später noch eingeblendet. Genau, die könnt ihr euch dann angucken. Und ja, also nochmal, die Veranstaltung ist auf Englisch, weil JJ Bowler kein Deutsch spricht, verständlicherweise. Ihr könnt Fragen stellen auf YouTube, die werden mir dann weitergereicht. Die könnt ihr aber auch gerne auf Deutsch stellen und ich übersetze sie dann einfach. Genau, und now let's switch back to English. Let's switch back to you. So I'll just give a really brief introduction. You can correct me. So JJ Bowler is a writer and a poet. So you started writing poetry books before anything else and published
Yes.
3 different collections. And then you published a novel with the name No Place to Call Home. And then most recently, your book Sei kein Mann, or Mask Off in English. I'll just hold the German version into the camera for a moment. Which also was a Spiegel bestseller, so also a bestseller in Germany. And it's about redefining masculinity. And yeah, it's great to have you here to talk about the book with you directly tonight. And before we start with the readings, did you expect for your book to become not just a national bestseller, but also to become really popular in Germany?
I mean, firstly, I feel very privileged to even be having this conversation, but I did not expect it to reach the level that it did. Even when I was writing the book, Mask Off, the English version, when I heard, when my agent informed me that, because Germany was the first kind of country that was interested in translation, I was completely shocked. And then to hear and see the way that, German people have embraced it and it started a discussion amongst many different people and platforms has been really incredible. Pretty much every day, I get messages or an email from someone kind of in Germany who is saying how the book has really helped them think about some of their own issues and tackle certain subjects, or they've passed it on to the people around them. I think that's really incredible, and I feel very privileged to be the person who has written such a book.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then I would say let's dive right in. What is a good chapter to introduce people to your book? What do you like to read first?
So I think the first chapter is a good one to start from, because in the opening chapter, not the introduction, but the chapter that's called Real Men, it talks about myths of masculinity. And in that chapter, I'm kind of talking about the expectations that is set by society of how men should be that don't really make sense, but somehow everyone conforms to it. And so maybe I can read a part about that.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna read. I'm gonna read from. So the chapter starts from page 10, but I'm gonna start from page 11, and the heading is Real Man.
Thank you. So you were talking about typical phrases like man up, be a man, and how things like not to cry, not to wear makeup, not to show emotions, these are culturally specific ways of being a man. They're not set in stone. So you're saying masculinity is a performance in a sense. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. Masculinity is a performance in that we learn how to behave in ways that are typically masculine according to the culture or perhaps the society that we're born into. So I use myself as an example as, this is how I kind of came to the understanding was, so my family is originally from Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a francophone country. And I grew up in the UK. And so what was normal for men in Congo actually is quite different to what is normal for men in the UK. There are obviously many things that are very similar, but there's many that's also different. For example, fashion, sense of style, sense of dress, taking care of your appearance is incredibly important and is an expectation of Congolese masculinity. And so I don't know if people would have heard the Sapel movement or about the Sapels, where it's this kind of like elite men who, and it's not just elite in terms of like finances and so forth, but it's in terms of like the way that they dress. They go around and they parade and they put on shows that show their kind of like their elegant side, their fashion side. But that was very normal for me in Congolese society to see men dressed up in amazing colors, to see men who care incredibly about their appearance. But then growing up in the UK society, it's almost as if there isn't an expectation about men's appearance at all. More so the pressure is placed on women. And that a woman has to take care of their appearance to a certain way, and that men's contribution is actually just material or financial. And so kind of being between these two worlds made me think of other things as well. And so for me, what I found myself as when I was in my Congolese community, I behaved in a particular way that conformed with those expectations of manhood, to dress smart, to dress well, to even dance, and be quite like, very kind of like emotional in the way we carry ourselves. But when I was around a more kind of Western or UK culture, I find that I did the opposite of that. I wasn't as expressive. I didn't really show pride in my appearance, and that wasn't expected of me. And so that's just a small example. Obviously, there are bigger examples and more serious examples as well. But I think that's just a small insight into the ways in which masculinity can be a performance. And there are some cultures around the world, like the Wadabe of Mali, where it is the men who are the ones who take pride in their appearance, and the women choose which man that they're going to take into their home. So it's almost like a very opposite way of, in comparison to Western society. And so these performances of masculinity shift in different ways according to the culture and the history all around the world.
I can definitely connect to that. Also, having several cultures in my life, do you think this, being confronted with the Congolese culture and UK culture, and maybe also the people living around you, that really helped you to look at your society from the outside? That is also maybe one of the root causes of why you got to write this book.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Can I ask you maybe what kind of cultures
Yeah, sure.
You go around. Yeah.
My mom's from Austria, my father's from Egypt, but I spent a
Oh,
long time in
wow.
the UK, so yeah.
Yeah. So, Egyptian culture, is it quite normal for men to hold hands as a
Yeah,
sign of like
absolutely.
affection?
Yeah.
Right. Right. So it's quite normal for, in Congolese culture for men to also do the same. I saw a lot of my parents, friends, uncles, etc., older men in my family holding hands. We grew up holding hands with other boys, other men, and that was normal. As soon as we came to the UK and tried to do anything like that, it was immediately stereotyped as a sexual act, you know. Um, and so those kind of like contrasting differences is what kind of placed a mirror up and made me really reflect on what is normal and what isn't. And actually, there is no such thing as this thing as normal. It's just whatever parameters that society decides is acceptable or not.
Yeah, in Egypt, for example, it's really normal to call each other Habibi, which means beloved, amongst
Yeah,
men all the time. But in German, that
yeah,
would sound
yeah.
so strange. But maybe, yeah, but maybe you want to read that part of your book where you walk together with your uncles to have food together, because I think that really shows that process of, feeling ashamed, feeling out of place, feeling like your masculinity was in peril,
Yeah.
kind of.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, sure. So this is the introductory story, which starts from page 1.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I could really empathize with that section of your book because it just shows how fragile masculinity is as well.
Exactly.
But let's get to a very central word in your book, patriarchy. Many people use it, but how do you define it? Can you just give us your basic definition? And then also, I find it really interesting that you say it's not just harmful for women, it's also harmful for men. That might not seem too directly understandable for many people, but maybe you could just quickly explain why. So, what is patriarchy, and why is it harmful for men and for women?
I would say patriarchy is quite simply one of the systems that dominate our society, in which it gives men, and particular type of men, privilege and advantages over other men and over women, and our people of other genders as well. So this system creates a hierarchy where a particular type of man is placed at the top, and usually, especially in this kind of Western global imperialist society, it is the white straight man who is placed at the top, or the most privileged in this society rather, and then the rest are kind of placed within a hierarchy that often is below them, and their lives are impacted differently. And so for me, that's how I see patriarchy in quite simple terms. But the difference is, as well, as you were saying, it's also something that's harmful towards men. We don't realize often as men the negative impact that it has on us. So in many ways, as men, we are privileged because it does give us certain advantages in society. But in many other ways, it's also very harmful to us, but obviously not as harmful as it is to women and to people of other genders. And we can go into a bit about that as well.
Yeah, sure. What I find quite interesting, so you touch on a lot of different topics, like you talk about popular culture, social media, pornography, video games. And what was surprising is that, or not surprising, but kind of fresh, kind of new, that you say that popular culture, social media, pornography, and video games have a really negative impact on society. And that's often you hear something that conservatives would say, like pornography is bad, popular culture is bad. But you are also critical of these things. And why do you think it's important that progressives are also critical of the effect that pornography might have?
Because I think we have to be, in an attempt to create a more progressive, accepting society, we also have to be very self-critical about what we consume as a society. And often people sometimes think progressive means just allowing anything without analysis or without any kind of critical reflection. I think it's very important for us to have critical reflection. And so when I talk about the impact of video games, particularly violent video games or violent movies or that kind of representation on mainstream media or even pornography, a lot of these are things that have been researched and are actually kind of major talking points within academic circles, but have not yet reached out into popular mainstream discussion. And so we take pornography, for instance, there are teenagers, kids younger than teenagers, who have direct access to quite graphic pornography through their mobile phones. Children younger than ever are accessing pornography in ways that we can't even realize. There's young people that I've worked with who now at a point where have been exposed to that and feel the kind of pressure to conform or also kind of copy those sexual acts within their relationships at such a young age, and I think in an attempt almost to seem maybe too liberal or too open, we sweep certain uncomfortable conversations under the carpet without realizing the effects that it's having on us. Like more men than ever are having basically penis surgery because they feel that their penis isn't large enough because they're consuming so much pornography. And obviously pornography is incredibly exaggerated. It's fantastical. It's an illusion. It's not based on real life. But there's more men than ever, particularly younger men, 18 to 30-year-old category, who are having body surgery to change certain parts of their body because they're watching pornography and they want to be like those men because they think that those are what real men are like. But the reality is that the majority of men are not like that. But also there's another conversation that we can have when it comes to these industries and how exploitative they are towards particularly women and young girls, and how some of these websites run kind of very exploitative child trafficking and sex trafficking kind of rings without us realizing that, if we don't have a critical conversation about it, a lot of young people could fall victim to these kind of environments.
And it's probably also just very close to the lived reality of the people that you work with. Young people probably spend a lot of time on social media with video games, consuming pornography, and also sports. That's also something you talk about. And I also find it interesting that most of you always point out that there are double-edged swords, that there can be positive aspects to it and negative aspects to it. Can you maybe talk a little bit about sports and how that can lead to a more open, enlightened kind of masculinity, but can also reinforce negative stereotypes?
Yeah.
Maybe you want to read as well a section.
Yeah, maybe I can read some as well, but I think I'll just say I find sport a really fascinating kind of medium for many people, but also for young men, because even sports is generally, whether it's a team sport or an individual sport, you have to have a certain amount of discipline to be able to train. We know that exercise is good for your mental health, communication skills. It builds up on that. It builds up on character, etc. All of these things that can really be helpful for the development of a young person or anyone of any age, really. And so for me, coming from a medium of like basketball, I found that sport gave me a lot of confidence to be able to kind of be myself and seek a community and learn some new skills and so forth. But also, we have to know that in sports, we follow a kind of top-down system. So we look at professional athletes who dominate those sports, and a lot of young people aspire to be like them. And so it's really interesting to see how different athletes in different sport react differently. So I think I mentioned in the book about Roger Federer, who, I've been watching him play tennis since he first became professional, and he's an incredible athlete. And one of the things I find fascinating about him particularly is his openness to show emotion. And so there's a top 10 on YouTube, there's a top 10 Roger Federer crying moments video that's like went viral and it's got millions of views. But it's not about his tennis. It's about all the moments that he spent crying, right? Now I think about how incredible that is to see. But here's a professional, and we all accept that male athletes, you know, can and should cry when they win. But can you imagine if, let's say you're a male lawyer, for instance, cried after they won a case, right? That person would be deemed unprofessional, you know, or if a male surgeon cried after they performed successful surgery, which is incredible, right? You know, and they cried because they were happy, but that would be deemed unprofessional. And so it's really interesting what spaces men are and aren't allowed to express themselves and which spaces dominate. And so when I talk about sport particularly, there is that double-edged sword because there's lots of positives. We see examples like that. But then unfortunately, there's a lot of other negatives as well when we see examples of like hooliganism, we see many examples of like racism or sexism, you know, locker room talk, locker room culture, etc., all of these kind of things.
But then you also say it's one of the spaces where the only space where you felt like you could cry as a young person in a locker room.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the times in those spaces, I saw other men crying, you know, and I saw other players crying. If we lost, what I found for me was that if we lost a game, I wasn't just crying about losing the game. I was also crying because I wasn't doing well at school, because I was frustrated at home, because of so many other reasons. But I didn't have any other place where I felt like I could cry about these things. So sport was the only place where I could get it all out and then kind of go back to hiding my emotions in everyday life. But, you know, that was when I was much younger. And so I think it's really important to talk to young people about using kind of these mediums to emotionally regulate, but also feel comfortable expressing their emotions in any other circumstance.
Cool. So is there a part in the book that you'd like to read on that topic?
Yeah, actually, I think what I will do is, so there's a chapter 8 called Slam Dunk the Funk, which is about masculinity and sport. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about my own kind of experience. So this is a slightly kind of long, not long, but it's a semi-long, but for those who are listening who may not know, as I mentioned, I was really passionate about basketball. My aspiration was to turn professional and hopefully, play one day in the NBA. When I was a teenager, we all have that fantasy. One of my favorite players is, the German player Dirk Nowitzki, who I loved watching.
Okay.
Yeah, I loved watching him growing up. So when he won the championship with Dallas in 2011, like I was supporting as much as I possibly could. So I'll read the part that I wrote about kind of my basketball experience. Sure.
Thank you. That was actually a perfect link to the next topic I wanted to talk about, because quite a large section of your book is devoted to the mental health issues that are connected with toxic masculinity. Can you just briefly talk about that?
Yeah, so as I kind of go into the book, statistics show that, for example, in terms of male suicide, men are 3 times will take their life or end their life at 3 times the higher rate than women do. That also men affected by, or equally affected by, such kind of mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. However, this isn't really represented. Depression is kind of shown as something that's sad and almost like a feminine aspect, but there's also many male professional athletes, but just men generally who really struggle with this and suffer with this. So I think that it's a really important conversation and a growing conversation that is being had, but still needs to, kind of be taken further.
Yeah, so you talk about the individual and how the individual person is affected by toxic masculinities, but you also talk about how it's connected to capitalism, to war culture, to extremism. And do you think that's like a blind spot we have as a society, as European societies, Western societies, that we don't really connect it to, how a certain type of being a man, perceiving masculinity can also lead to aggression on a societal level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's something that is just limited to Western society. I think there are different variations of these kind of pressures within all societies, because overwhelmingly, due to the global that we live in, like the majority of societies are patriarchal, and not just patriarchal, but they're patriarchal, they're capitalist, they are, imperialist, unfortunately, and they are societies that operate on a hierarchy, whether it's in terms of race, class, gender, or sexuality. And so, unfortunately, here in the West, largely, we take quite a narrow look or a narrow approach or singular approach that if it's just one issue, so it's just patriarchy, for instance, or one singular issue that's affecting someone, when in fact, it's all connected. So if you look at maybe like a young man who commits, like if there's a young man who perhaps is violent or sells drugs, they'll just look at it as like that individual man. They won't look at it as connected to, well, what kind of environment did that young man grow in? What is their economic social circumstance? Would that young person have to feel the pressure of selling drugs if they were supported economically, if society wasn't so materially driven, if housing was affordable, if education was affordable, if healthcare was affordable? All of these things, particularly as it's like root causes that lead to poverty, all of these things are connected. And so I think the more that we take a holistic approach towards understanding why these things happen, the more we'll be able to provide solutions for it. But at the moment, it just seems like we take a look at things one at a time and we're not really connecting the dots.
Yeah, your book also doesn't really let women off the hook. So you also talk about how women might perpetuate patriarchy. Can you elaborate on that? Explain that? What do you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just an honest conversation that we need to be aware of. So in writing this book where I critique patriarchy and I critique gender expectations in terms of, male behavior, but there's also what is known as internalized patriarchy, that, there are women who can be can have just as, if not more, toxic masculinity than a man, and if we look at certain women in power, for instance, like a classic example is Margaret Thatcher in the UK. She was one of the most, they call it like the Iron Fist, or the Iron Lady rather. So she was someone who really embodied this culture of like toxic masculinity, but clearly she was a woman. And I write, obviously there's other women who write that I think are better positioned to critique the way that women participate in patriarchy. But I think it's an important conversation to be had so that we don't continue to repeat the internalized patriarchy that is found in all of us, including women. So I don't want people to think that patriarchy is just men and women have no agency. I think it's also important that we have conversations about where all genders contribute to different aspects, whether it's patriarchy or racism or sexism, etc. We are all complicit in one way or another. And so it's important for us to hold up a mirror to ourselves and really ask ourselves the questions like, what are we doing?
Yeah, another thing that your book touches upon, and lots of people seem to be interested because many questions are about this, is how often we talk about patriarchy as something, or we see it mostly as something that is a problem in non-Western societies, or migrants are particularly patriarchal, or particularly hate women more than white people do. So it's often something we don't want to connect to ourselves, so we push it away and push it onto other cultures. But you say that in many countries it was also a colonial import, so something that was actually imposed on people who had very different ways of understanding gender before. So
Yeah, I mean, I'll take the example of my own country, Congo, because I'm probably best positioned to speak on that. So let's take Congo's conception of gender prior to slavery and colonialism. In Bantu Congo tradition, there was gender fluidity and sexual fluidity. And this was, for example, represented in that each person had a feminine and masculine side. And that was represented through your own like physical body, where your left hand was called Liboko ya Mwasi, which was your woman's hand, and your right hand was called Liboko ya Mobali, which was your man's hand. And in that, it showed a representation of both masculine and feminine energy. And what the Congo conception or creation story is that the first person to walk the earth was a being called Kimahungu, which was a perfect entity that was both masculine and feminine. And that entity divided itself almost like meiosis across the planet and multiplied. And that each person has both a balance of feminine and masculine energy that is reflective of this original being. And that you almost like your life mission is to find your partner who balances out your feminine and masculine energy. So in fact, it could be that there are two men, one who has more feminine energy, one who has more masculine energy, but they balance each other out, you know. But in kind of like Western society, we would see that as just a gay couple. You know, you wouldn't really think about like energy or spirituality or conception or anything like that. And so the conception of like gender and sexuality was much more fluid across the spectrum, which is a conversation that people are starting, or more recently, to come back to. Now, Congo, or the Kingdom of Congo, rather, is enslaved in 1491 by Portugal, and then later on colonized from 1885 by Belgium during the Berlin Conference. And that completely eviscerates Congolese tradition and spirituality and understanding, to the point where now it, you know, there are laws in not just in Congo but many other African countries where it is illegal for, you know, where kind of gay relationships, etc., are illegal. And that's because of the colonial religious mission that eradicated traditional beliefs of Kimahungu and what I mentioned earlier, and said that the only way is the Euro-Christian way. And so you have to abandon your belief. And literally anyone who didn't believe that was killed. I mean, there were 10 million Congolese people who were killed during the Congo colonial mission. And so if we look at the damage that does to the physical damage that does to people's bodies and mental health, but also the damage it does to the knowledge and understanding of the way that we see the world through traditions and through cultures, right? And then now we get to a point where many people aren't even aware that those traditional cultures even existed, because the current education system, both in Congo and the West as well, favors that kind of Western domination. And so I think that through the examples that I give, not just in Congo, but in many places around the world, in the Americas, and if we look at Native American tradition, you know, there's at least 5 genders that was considered part of the Native American tradition. And so a lot of these traditions that were pre-colonial viewed gender and viewed sexuality that was on a spectrum, that was fluid, that was different to everyone. And there was no kind of fixation on what is right and what is wrong. And so I think it's important for people to understand this when they start to kind of get their mind around understanding sexuality and gender as well, so that they can move forward, because we almost have to move back to move forward, if that makes sense. So we can't understand where we're going unless we understand what existed before. So really, with this conversation about gender fluidity, transgender, etc., we're not having a new conversation. This is things that already existed. Now it's about how do we create or recreate a society where people's existence are accepted as normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I think a lot of people have this desire to find new sources of inspiration when it comes to gender and sexuality, because sometimes we seem so stuck, or we feel so stuck. And you were talking about colonialism, but you're also writing about how racism still impacts masculinity. Maybe you want to read that section from your book?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll just quickly say, I mean, this might seem like an obvious statement, but in a lot of times now, especially when it comes to race, and not just racism, but any form of prejudice and systemic inequality, they're very uncomfortable conversations. And so if you're in a position of privilege, people prefer to ignore the conversation and look away rather than address it. Because when you address the conversation, you realize the ways in which you may have participated, even if it's unintentional, but the ways in which you may have participated in maintaining that kind of prejudice or maintaining that status quo. So if we think about it, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, whatever it is, in terms of class, like we have to have an honest conversation. You know, I'm a Black man, yes, but I'm also a man. So where I am prejudiced against in this society for my race, I also have a certain amount of privilege because of my gender. And so that kind of is about the theory of, you know, intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw wrote about. And I think that we're all slowly starting to get our head around. But yeah, I'll read the part on race, which is on page 77. Oh, it might be different for the German version actually, but it's chapter 6.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah.
Thank you. That's funny about Iceland. I had no idea.
Yeah, Iceland smoked the most weed in the world. So, you know, and I think if you ask the average person which country they think would smoke the worst weed, it would not be Iceland.
Yeah, definitely not, for sure. When you were reading the part about racism, I had to think about a debate that we also often have in Germany within the BPOC community about whether you should first fight racism or sexism or toxic masculinities within your own communities. Do you think we have to make a decision because Black men or Arab men or men of color are vilified so much already that we shouldn't have this discussion out in the open, but maybe have it hidden or in safe spaces or not have it at all? Or can we have both conversations at the same time?
I think it's important to have both conversations at the same time, because I feel like to deal with race first, then to deal with gender, then to deal with sexuality, it takes away from people's lived experience and the human worth that people have. You know, if we say, okay, we're going to talk about race first and put gender aside, there are, you know, young girls, there are women, there are, you know, elderly women who are at the moment at risk of violent harm or crime because of gender issues. Those need to be addressed right now. And so I think there are enough of us who are aware and passionate about different issues, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's class, that we can have these conversations collectively and at the same time. However, I think the key is how we have these conversations and where we have these conversations. Often a lot of conversations where you're trying to make people aware of an issue can come across quite condescending, like you're speaking down on someone. And so for me, I never try to speak down on someone. What I try to do is to try to get people to ask questions about why they see the world in a particular way, why they see something as normal, and whether things are different or have ever been different. And I think when you empower people to think critically and to ask questions about what they are invested in, and then they can kind of learn the skills to say, maybe this isn't right after all. But typically some conversations say, oh, you did this, and point fingers, when in fact that isn't really helpful in terms of creating an understanding and helping people come out of that kind of conditioning. So yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's really important that we take a holistic approach and a kind of collective effort in dealing with these issues all at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you were saying about your the tone or how you want to address people, I think that has been mentioned a couple of times by different people who've read your book. It's also on the back of the German version of the book that your tone is very special, because it's not confrontative, it's not aggressive, it's very gentle in a way. Like it seems like your book is not about arguing, but it's more about convincing people or explaining something to people who might be curious, interested in feminism or another kind of masculinity, but still not convinced or not familiar with the terms. So was that your intention with the book? To reach these kinds of people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was not just my intention, but also that's how I came to an understanding about it. I mean, I grew up in just as toxic environment as anyone else. And I think for me, I didn't come to this understanding by myself. When I read other writers such as Bell Hooks, who was an incredible inspiration, but she spoke about systemic issues as well as her own personal life in such an endearing way that I felt really connected to who she was. I felt really connected to the people who gave me their time and had conversations, because we all just want to learn. Sometimes we don't know where to go. But the thing is like understanding vulnerability is a really key issue, because we live in a society where being in the wrong is seen as bad, even if you are in the wrong. Like, to actually say, you know what, I'm wrong is really bad. So even when someone might not have a helpful opinion, do they have the space to be able to feel comfortable to say, you know what, I don't know about this issue, or I used to think like this, and now I don't think like this because I had that conversation with someone. And so I think it's about helping to connect with people and actually show some understanding. And then, and this is how I intended to write the book, because I write this book to anyone from a point of, I was also someone who, was really stuck in that mindset. Like, that was what was normal for me. And when I had those conversations, I felt incredibly challenged. I mean, I remember first reading some books and having these conversations. Everything that I thought was normal, or I thought was the way to see the world, was completely shattered. And so I had to reconstruct a reality and understanding that was much healthier. And I'm very glad that I went through that uncomfortable journey. But we're talking about, if you're having a conversation with a 20-year-old, that's 20 years likely of a particular way that they've been kind of conditioned about the world. So they're not going to suddenly change just from one conversation saying, hey, you're wrong. No, it's about understanding. And I think that's the key here.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also another way of achieving that for you is how personal your book is, because in parts it's deeply personal, and you are very vulnerable in your book. You write about your own experiences. And did you do that exactly for the purpose to connect with readers and show them, like, I'm opening up, I'm talking about this, so you can do that too. You can connect to my experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think just as human beings, we connect more with stories than we do with statistics, right? And so I could tell you a statistic that 90%, which is a true statistic, 90% of homeless people are men, right? Like, people will look at that and be shocked, rightfully shocked. But will they do something? I don't know. But if I told you a story about how one day I stopped and spoke to a homeless man, and, you know, he was someone who was educated and played the piano, but unfortunately, you know, lost his job, didn't have any savings, ended up on the street with no social network and so forth, and no support. And I started to speak with him, and we built up a conversation, a connection, and then he was able to get support. And I was speaking to someone the importance of supporting each other. You know, that can help us create a greater bond and a deeper understanding than just saying, you know, a percentage of something. I think it's about how we connect on a personal level, how we connect on a human level. And if the pandemic situation that we're in now has taught us not anything, it's definitely taught us that we all need that human connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. So we've spoken a lot about what kind of masculinity we don't want and what we want to get rid of. But what is the end point for you? What do you want all of us to move towards? Is that another kind of masculinity that you can define? Or is it a plurality? Or is it actually, as you said before in the Congolese story you told us about, to maybe merge the two, masculinity, femininity, or see everyone as like a conglomeration of the two? So what should we move towards?
So, I mean, for me, I think the first step is what I say is like moving away from the gender binary, you know, moving away from the expected limited roles, rigid roles that like a man is like this or a woman is like that, and that's it. Like, the gender binary, I think, divides us in so many ways and disconnects us from ourselves and from each other as well. And I think if we can move away from that gender binary, that women is here and man is here, that, you know, left is here and right is here, that kind of opposition, that separation, and we start to see things in a more fluid way, in a way that doesn't have limitations, in a way that doesn't have strict borders of what is and what isn't, of what can be allowed and what can't be allowed. I think that will help to create a much healthier version. I don't want to say that, you know, Congolese masculinity is the way forward, because there's many examples where aspects of Congolese patriarchal society is very, very wrong. You know, and I don't want to say that the Western model is the best way, or the global South model is the best way, or South America. You know, there's lots of problems that you'll find elsewhere. But I think what would be best is for us to ask ourselves, are we living our healthiest lives, not just as men, but also as human beings? You know, and I think that's the kind of direction that we need to go in, something that actually gives us freedom and liberates us rather than puts us in a box.
Mm-hmm. And something to help us to get there, you say in your book, is feminism. And you say very interestingly that there's no other ideology that cares more for men. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit and also read that section in your book about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just in terms of like feminism, there being no ideology that cares for men, I think, you know, now that the statistics are starting to come out about male suicide, or like I mentioned, male homelessness, or that men are more likely to be addicted to drugs or substance misuse. These issues, firstly, were raised by feminists, right? So feminist women raise these issues in terms of men needing to access these support to liberate themselves from patriarchy. But since then, there has been no collective movement of men that has come to look after other men that's been bigger than feminism, you know? And so I always say to men, it's like, well, when I have conversations with men about feminism and men who are particularly resistant to feminism, I say, okay, feminism's bad for us. Okay, then name what we're doing as men collectively that's good for us. And the conversation just goes silent, you know. Or I'll ask, name a bigger movement than feminism that has helped us as men, that's come from us men. And the conversation goes silent. And, I'm happy to be wrong. I'm happy for anyone out there to come and say, oh, actually, do you know about this male movement, which is bigger than feminism or whatever? Like, we can talk about racial justice movements and, people will say civil rights, people will say Black Lives Matter, especially now. But, when it comes to gender equality movements, the main has been feminism, Me Too, etc. But what has been a movement that men have created that have supported men? And so I think that's where we have to have a realistic conversation about where we're at as men, and the fact that because we don't like to ask for help doesn't mean that we don't need help, and it's not that we don't like to ask for help, it's that we're socially conditioned to not ask for help. And so if you think about that kind of context, it's not that men don't need help. It's not that men shouldn't help each other. It's that we allow ourselves to become so isolated that things become really kind of like worse until someone else comes along and helps us, So it's like, okay, how do we actually now help ourselves? But yeah, I'll read the part on gender equality a little bit. Okay, so I'll read the part on male privilege, and it tells a little bit about feminism.
Cool, thanks a lot. I have 2 final questions, but before I ask you these, there are lots of questions that came in from the audience on YouTube.
Oh, yes.
So let's start with those. So the first one here on my pile is from the Collectif James Baldwin. In the Caribbean, Black men were sold like cattle. Women were left alone with the kids. Boys were brought up to be tough, to be a violence, because that would be and still is their reality. So I guess it's not a question, but something you could react to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably more a reflection of what was happening during slavery and colonialism. Black men were sold as cattle, but also Black women were sold as cattle. Black children were sold as cattle. That was the hierarchical system that was present in those times. But we still live in a legacy of that system. And I think that it's important for us to understand, especially as Black people, what we have internalized that comes from that system that doesn't allow us to see ourselves as human beings, and what is actually our true origin and culture. And I think those kind of conversations are really important to be had.
Thank you. So the next one comes from Sabrina. She's saying, generally speaking, how do women in a majority of cases get into positions of power? In my view, only by following existing structures and mimicking the behavior of their predecessors' colleagues. So I guess that's what you were saying about Margaret Thatcher and
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100% agree with her. When you see, often cases when you see women in positions of power, typically they have followed that. But it's really interesting seeing someone, for example, like Jacinda Ardern
I just wanted to say.
Of New Zealand, where if you look at her politics and the way that she's responded to the pandemic, leading with a politics of compassion and humanity. Now, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that she's perfect, but I think that the way that she's leading, the qualities that she's showing is absolutely incredible, for anyone. And I think that is one that we can really learn from and move towards making that the norm rather than just individualizing it as if it's just her. How do we make those kind of politics something that's actually desired, and people see it as the norm and the expectation?
So there are some signs of hope, a new leadership style kind of emerging.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay, cool. Okay, next one from Sebastian, I think. How does this acting, this performance of masculinity, differ when in company of other men versus women, and why?
I mean, it's really interesting, right? We know that men perform differently around other men versus around women. And so if you look at, for example, gym culture, right? Almost if you're a man who goes to the gym, and it's usually men that are around, the way that men act when a woman walks in suddenly becomes almost like this competition, the chauvinism, this desire to be spotted out and to be seen and so forth. And it's essentially just kind of what is the politics of observation and being observed. Ultimately, patriarchy and privilege, etc., all of these link to what is like our social status and what is us kind of being granted access to certain people or to certain positions and so forth. And I think those performances are actually really a desire for us to have access to, whether it's economic privilege, whether it's entitlement to women and women's bodies, whether it's like a social status thing. And so I always ask myself, if someone's acting differently around a group of men versus a group of women, I'll say, what is it that they really want? And often you'll find that what this person wants or is actually looking for is to be accepted, is to be seen as above the rest. It's almost like a social status competition, to be privileged. And then you just have to kind of critique that, and hopefully you don't repeat the same behaviors.
Okay, I'll just check the time. Okay, a bit more than 15 minutes. So this question is from somebody called Tripartite Struggle, I think. So straight cis male here. Feminism is a way of critiquing power structures. I have found in conversations with feminists that there is little space for talking about masculinity that hurts from patriarchy. How can we create space for masculinity in the conversation against patriarchy, particularly feminism, without it devolving into a pain competition of sorts?
So I think one of the things that tends to happen is that when, as a man, if you become aware of feminism, and you actually see its benefits and you may even support it, which is great, we often go into women's spaces where they're talking about women's issues and then bring men's issues in the feminist space. And what ends up happening is that ends up silencing women's issues, or it ends up creating a kind of conflict, between, hold on, because I say patriarchy hurts men too, right? Which is an important conversation to have. But it's not that we have this conversation in place of women. We're not trying to erase women's conversation. And so what I think is important is for men to create these spaces, particularly among other men, and raise these issues. So raise it with a kind of like feminist principle, with feminist principles, with principles of gender equality. And I think that has to be the main focus. So rather than us going out to find women's spaces where we can have these conversations, we should have these conversations among ourselves, amongst our best friends, male friends, amongst our dads, our uncles, our brothers. We should create male support groups where we can have these conversations and then kind of build from there. Because I think that for women, the effects of patriarchy that they are responding and resisting is a lot more harmful and violent than what we as men are responding and resisting against. And so it's really important that we don't erase women's experiences, but we actually listen and then we take it as like knowledge so that we can improve our own kind of experiences as well as men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the next question connects to that. This is from Yaz. Can you describe your social work with boys about masculinity? How was it? If I remember right, that I read that you worked with boys. So yeah,
Yes.
how did they react and perceive it?
So I've done various types of work with young, like secondary school age boys and young men as well. And it's been really interesting. And I think, and especially for me, very eye-opening. And I'll give an example. For example, there was two boys who got into a fight. And, these were the two boys. One of the boys particularly, he was like, kind of very violent and aggressive and associated with different things, gang cultures, knife culture, whatever, all of these things. So he got into a fight. I separated it and I was speaking with him one-to-one. And I was just kind of trying to get to know, but what is the issue? Why did you get into a fight? And then he was very quiet and was saying, oh, it's not his fault, whatever. And then all of a sudden, just like that, he just started crying. Like he was literally like full on tears. Just really, really emotional, really crying. And he was talking about, the struggles that he was having at home, that no one cares about him. He thinks no one cares about his life. His life isn't worth anything, and so forth. And that to me was like, wow, here's a boy who walks around, especially in the school kind of environment, who was walking around being strong, being aggressive, sometimes pushing around other boys, not taking things seriously, showing all the confidence, all the air of confidence in the world. But actually, when you sat him down and spoke to him on a one-to-one level, he was just a vulnerable young child who needed care, who needed support, who needed love, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the most eye-opening things, that no matter how much bravado or strength or, aggression that a young boy or man can have, that deep down inside, that desire to be cared for, to be loved, is still in them. Mm-hmm. So it's like, how do we move towards having a conversation with these young boys to show that they are also loved, and that they should also care about their own lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the end of your book, so you don't just analyze, you also give us a few hints, some advice of how we can change, how we can create a better society and change perceptions of masculinity. And you also talk about love, how boys need to be socialized into love. So maybe we have about 10 minutes left. Do you want to read some parts of your last chapter?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the last chapter is what I call the conclusion. It's man in the mirror, and it's transgression and transformation. So for me, it's about how do we look at what we haven't done, but then also look at what we can do. And so I'll read that, and I think I'll just read maybe a couple of the suggestions that I made. Also, just a side note, so it was Valentine's Day recently, and I sent two messages. So I've got some group chats on WhatsApp where I'm friends with like some of my guy friends. Mm-hmm. On one group, I sent a message to all the guys saying, I love you guys, happy Valentine's Day, and some like little kisses emoji. Mm-hmm. And then those guys are like, oh man, look at this guy, what are you doing? Whatever. And then there was another group where I sent the same message, I love you guys, happy Valentine's Day, heart kisses. And then the rest of the guys were like, oh, happy Valentine's Day, love you too, whatever. And you can see the difference. There's two different types of guy. And I was like, well, one is the guy who hasn't read the book, and the other is the guy who has read the book. So we need love, mm-hmm. We need love. Love, men have to be comfortable with saying I love you to other men without adding bro or man, or to make it more acceptable, without adding no homo, which reduces men expressing love to other men to a question of sexuality. Love and acceptance from ourselves, from those around us, makes us feel comfortable in who we are, or in our own skin.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, 8 minutes. I'll squeeze two more questions into this. So
Okay.
in the beginning of our talk, we spoke about how pop culture, popular culture can have a negative impact, but then you're also saying that what kind of started you rethinking masculinity was also through popular culture. Tupac, for example, or who is the second person you mentioned? I can't remember at the moment, but can you just talk about how songs and films can also have a
Yeah.
good and positive impact? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why, I mean, I was saying earlier, like we have to have a realistic, self-critical conversation about what we're consuming and what we're allowing to be exposed to other people or what we're allowing to be normalized. And so I use Tupac as an example because as Tupac, you know, on the one hand, absolutely, he was very problematic. So it's not to excuse him. Definitely very problematic on the one hand. But on the other hand, there was, you know, certain messages that he kind of espoused in his songs that showed those principles of like wanting to create a fairer, equal society on the basis of gender, etc. And so there's certain examples of that, like that. And I think I say that to say this, that we are deeply influenced by portrayals and representations in the media, by what we listen to in music. And I think it's incredibly important for us to actually be aware of what we are listening to. And so when, you know, like the title Mask Off is originally taken from a title by a rapper called Future. And in that song, Future is talking about sex, drugs, masculinity, spending money, all the materialistic stuff. But actually, in the original version of that song that was written in the 1970s, Tommy Butler, the person who sang it, and it was originally called Prison Song, he's talking about love, he's talking about justice, he's talking about a fairer society. And so we as people who are consuming all of these media, all of the stuff that is in the mainstream, we have to be a bit more vocal about what we want to see and what we don't want to see. So if we see something that's having a negative effect, we actually need to be critical of that. And I think sometimes we don't speak about it enough.
Yeah, that's true. All right, last 5 minutes. So what I'm really interested in, so you published a book in 2019. A lot has happened since then. So have your thoughts in any way developed or changed, or is there something that you have a different opinion on right now, or something that you wish you had included in the book? So what process have you been through since then?
Oh, wow. I mean, yeah, a year on since having published the book, it's just been over a year. Well, when it first came out in the UK. I mean, the world has completely changed as far as we know it, you know. I don't think anyone could have really anticipated it changing to this extent. What with the pandemic, not just the pandemic, but social justice movements, you know, the politics, global politics being the way that it is. And there's so much more that I could add to it. But I think one of the things that I could add to this particular book, but I think one of the things I really want to stress is during the pandemic and the lockdown particularly, one of the consequences of it, particularly for women, is that rate of domestic violence has gone up. So in the UK, domestic violence has gone up by about 25% since the start of the lockdown on and off pandemic. And you think about that, and you think about statistics that show that, like, you know, victims of sexual assault, sexual violence, often know who their perpetrators are, and that the home is often the most dangerous place for a woman to be. And if you think about that in the context of all of us having to be at home, what does that mean for so many women out there who are potentially in dangerous situations? And there's also that, but then I also think about it also reinforced a lot of what I believe, that no matter who we are and what we might think of ourselves, that we actually deeply need human connection, that we actually deeply need each other. We need that love, we need that empathy, we need that kindness. And the fact that we've been so removed from each other, hopefully when this kind of goes back to normal, we can start working towards creating a fairer, more empathic society.
Okay, thank you so much. I think this is the end of the talk. Thanks so much for taking the time, talking to us, reading to us, really enriching to talk to you. Great book. Check it out, everybody who's watching in German or in English. And yeah, all the best of luck to you. And hopefully we'll see more books of you in the future and then invite you in person here next time.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Care. Thank you. Bye. Vielen Dank auch an alle. Und folgt uns auf Instagram, folgt uns auf Facebook. Es gibt noch mehr Lesungen in der Zukunft. Die Reihe ist noch nicht vorbei. Und wie gesagt, im Frühling beginnt dann auch die Ausstellung, die man sich angucken kann, mit hoffentlich noch mehr Veranstaltungen, Lesungen, Diskussionen zu ähnlichen Themen. Genau. Vielen Dank und einen schönen Abend.